Chapter 7. Fear not, for I have redeemed thee. They must have had an earthquake down at Lewis's this morning, Howard Minturn said to the boys who were gathered around the schoolroom door. The first bell is not rung yet, and there comes Tip up the hill. Up the hill came Tip, sure enough, with a firm, resolute step. The summer vacation was over. The fall term was to commence this morning, and among the things which Tip had resolved to do was this one, to come steadily and promptly to school during the term, which was something that he had never done in his life. The public school was the best one in the village, so he had the best boys in town for school companions, as well as some of the worst. "Hello, Tip," said Bob Turner, coming partly down the hill to meet him. "How are you, old fellow?" Bob had been away during most of the vacation, and knew nothing of the changes which there had been in his absence. Tip winced a little at his greeting, shivered a little at the thought of the temptation which Bob would be to him. The two had been linked together all their lives in every form of mischief and wrong. They seemed almost a part of each other, at least they had seemed so, until within these few weeks. Now Tip felt, rather than knew, how far separated they must be. The bell rang, and the boys jostled and tumbled against each other to their seats. Bob Turner, as usual, seated himself beside Tip. But then Bob only came to school about 2 forenoons in a week, so perhaps they might get along. When the Bible reading commenced, Tip hesitated, and his face flushed. He had never owned a Bible to read from before, but this morning his new one lay in his pocket. The question was, had he courage to take it out? What would the boys think? What would they say? How should he answer them? He began to think he would wait until tomorrow morning. Then he grew hot and ashamed as he saw that he was already trying to hide his colors. Suddenly he drew out his Bible and began very hurriedly to turn the leaves. Bob heard the rustling and, glancing around, puckered his lips as if he were going to whistle, and snatching the book, read the name which Mr. Holbrook had written therein. Then he whispered, "You don't say so! When did we steal a Bible and turn saint?" The blood growing hotter and redder in Tip's cheeks was his only answer, but he felt that his temptation had begun. The next thing was to read. When he had finally found the place, even though there were more than 50 voices reading those same words, yet poor Tip imagined his would be louder than all the rest, and he choked and coughed, and made more than one trial before he forced his voice to join, even in a whisper, at the words, "And they clothed him with purple, and plaited a crown of thorns, and put it above his head." It did not help him in his reading that Bob made his lips move with the rest, but said loud enough for him to hear, "The man in the moon came down too soon," and continued to repeat some senseless or wicked rhymes through the reading of the beautiful chapter. How thankfully Tip bowed his head that morning! His heart had taken in some of the sweet words. That sacred head had been crowned with thorns, indeed, but he knew it was crowned with glory now, and he knew that Christ had suffered and died for him. He joined with his whole heart in Mr. Burrows' prayer, and though Bob pulled his hair and tickled his foot and stepped on his toes, the bowed head was not lifted, and his spirit gathered strength. But Tip never forgot the trials of that day, nor the hard work which he had to endure them. Bob was, as usual, overflowing with mischief, and failing in finding the willing helper which he had expected in his old companion, took revenge in aiming a great many of his pranks at him, such senseless, silly things as he did to annoy. Tip spread his slate over with a long row of figures which he earnestly tried to add, and having toiled slowly up the first 2 columns, Bob's wet finger was slyly drawn across it, and no trace of the answer, so hardly earned, appeared. Then, too, he had his own heart to struggle against. He was so used to whispering to this boy and that boy seated near him, to eating apples when the teacher's back was turned, to making an ugly-looking picture on a piece of paper and pinning it on the back of a small boy before him. He was so unused to sitting still and trying to study. What hard work it was to study anyway. It seemed to him he could never get that spelling lesson in the whole world. The harder he tried, the more bewildered he grew. A dozen times he spelled the two words receive and believe, standing so closely together, each time sure he was right, and each time discovering that the I's and E's must change places. He grew utterly provoked and disheartened, and would have fairly cried had not Bob been beside him to see the tears and grow merry over them. Finally he lost all patience with Bob, and turning fiercely to him, after he had for the third time pitched the greasy old spelling book upside down onto the floor, said, "Look here now, if you come that thing again, I'll pitch you out of the window quicker than wink." "Edward Lewis, marked for whispering," said Mr. Burrows. "Edward, you have commenced the term as usual, I see, the first one marked for bad conduct." How Tip's ears burned! How untrue it was! He had not commenced this term as usual. How differently he had tried to commence it, only he and God knew. And now to fail this early in the day! His head seemed to spin and his brain reel. He bowed himself on the seat again, but Bob's head went down promptly and whispered, "Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep." How often Tip had thought such things as these so very funny that he could not possibly help laughing. How silly and meaningless, yes, and cruel did they seem to him now. Oh, Satan was struggling for Tip today. He was reaping the fruits of long weeks spent in evil company and folly. He looked over to the back seats where sat Howard Minturn and Ellis Holbrook, hard at work on their algebra lesson, nobody thinking of such a thing as disturbing them, and as he looked, sighed heavily. If he had only gained such a place as they had in the school, how easily he could work today. They were very little older than he, yet here he was trying to do an example in addition, doing it over 4 times before it was right, and they were at the head of the class in algebra. If he could only jump to where they were and go on with them, and the hopelessness of this thought made his spelling lesson seem harder. And so it was no wonder when the class formed and he took his old place at the foot, and he stayed there, and spelled believe E-I after all, nobody was surprised, but nobody knew how very, very, very hard he had tried. The long day, crowded full of trouble and temptation, to poor Tip wore away,